30-plus years of experience. He's currently the Chief Global Strategist at Horizon Investments. Seems like he's been a DC guy all his life, so he knows the ins and outs. Is that right? He was, I guess he was the Director of Research at Charles Schwab Washington Research Group. He's a frequent guest on TV. I'm sure many of you have seen him on TV. And like I said, we're lucky to have him today, so I'm going to get off the stage and let Greg give us his take on life here.
Thank you. Let's see if we can make this work. Great to be here. Really thrilled to be in a city that has a football team that has a perfect record. Glad to see that. Let's see. Hopefully this will work. If it doesn't, I think you can hear it anyway. So I like to stand up here. Well, the best thing I can say about this election is that it's over. It was an election where every morning from Labor Day until November 8th, I'd wake up in a different city, asking myself if I should laugh or cry in the morning. Usually I tried to laugh, so I would just start with the single funniest thing I heard during this entire election campaign. I was at LaGuardia, got in a cab. Cab driver was a very talkative guy from Romania, a naturalized U.S. citizen, talked about everything. So I couldn't resist. I said, "Sir, I've got to ask you, who are you voting for?" This was in October. And he turned around quickly and looked at me with a really sincere look and said, "Sir, it's really difficult. They're both so good." That was the single funniest thing I heard. I never thought I'd hear it. He went on to explain it. He couldn't decide because they were both so excellent. So you can hear anything, I think, in New York. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 big things. We'll spend a little bit of time on the election. We'll spend a little bit of time on the Washington, D.C. climate now. I think the shock is finally worn off. It's taken a while. But what I want to spend most of my time on is what I think Trump can get done in the next year or so. And I think the answer is a lot. There'll be an awful lot that he can get done. He's got the votes on just about every key issue. So I'll go through taxes, infrastructure, all of that stuff. But a few minutes first, just on the election. I am one of these pundits who did not get it right. I think just about everyone thought that she would win. I have some friends from PNC here, I think, who have heard me over the last few months say there were many reasons why she could have lost. I thought it was going to be close, but like just about everyone, the signals that I saw didn't register. I point out to people that I was in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania in June, and everyone came up to me after a speech and said, "They're going to vote for Trump in Bethlehem." And I asked them why, and they all said, "Because he's going to bring back the steel industry to Bethlehem." Do you believe in the Easter Bunny as well, that the steel industry is coming back to Bethlehem? But there were plenty of signals, so I'll just tell you one other joke. It's serious. We'll talk about all the policy stuff. The classic joke was a fellow who was an accountant, woke up as usual at 5:55, he saw his clock, went down to the kitchen, looked at the thermometer outside, and it was 55 degrees. He was running late, so we took a cab into work, and it was $5.55. He started to get a little suspicious. He was an accountant and began working on a big project. He's thinking, "I'm seeing all these signals." So he added up his first big assignment of the day, and it was $5,555,000. He scratches his head and says, "I'm going to go out to Aqueduct. I'm going to go to the racetrack. Something's happening here." So he takes a long cab ride out to Aqueduct, which is near JFK, $55, paid the driver, went into the track. He said, "I want to put down $555 on horse number 5 in the 5th race." He put the money down, and the horse finished 5th. So sometimes you can see all sorts of signals, and the signals that I think a lot of us saw were signals that didn't register. I just read a story about an hour ago in Politico about the Hillary Clinton campaign in Brooklyn, basically telling all of their people to ignore reports that Michigan was tightening. They did not put extra forces into Michigan because they were convinced they were going to win Michigan. They knew they were going to lose Ohio. But there was an awful lot of hubris, a lot of bad decisions. So let me just start with a quick comment on why she lost. You could say the people in Brooklyn were tone deaf. You could point to her inexplicable refusal to visit Wisconsin during the entire campaign. She never set foot in Wisconsin. All sorts of miscues that she made, but for me, I will look back on it with one simple explanation. It was 2016. 2016 will be remembered for years, if not decades to come, because of all of the very unique global trends that we still see today. And you look at all of these trends, and she was on the wrong side of all of them. Number one was this tremendous antipathy toward the establishment. Number two was great public displeasure with globalization. Number three was a great public dislike of Wall Street. And you look at these three issues. She was the ultimate establishment candidate. Despite her gender, she was about as establishment as you can get. Number two was that I think when it comes to globalization, she was hurt badly by charges that she was an architect of NAFTA. She initially was an architect of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think very unadroitly pivoted on that issue. And then third, Bernie Sanders spent almost an entire year blasting her as the candidate from Wall Street and Goldman Sachs, and I think that a lot of young voters believed it and stayed at home because of that. So on these three really pivotal issues, she was on the wrong side in the year 2016. Not a good year for someone like her to run. But I think you've got to say the big story, obviously, was Trump. And a few words on Trump before we get to the policy stuff. First of all, I was surprised. Nobody wrote in the press, and not very many people wrote. In the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, he became a pretty damn good candidate. He did 5 or 6 events a day, showed tremendous energy. He stopped tweeting for those 2 or 3 weeks. He's back at it now, as we know. Somebody, Kellyanne Conway probably, got to him, and he stopped tweeting. And he stayed on message for those last 2 or 3 weeks. He was on message, he was vigorous. I think he morphed into a first-rate candidate in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, after doing all these outrageous things in the weeks before that. But beyond that, just a couple of comments on my take on this phenomenal, passionate support for Trump. And for over a year, I went all around the country. I tried to get out of the Beltway as much as possible. I talked to a lot of Trump supporters, and they all said almost the same thing, that we still worry about layoffs. We still worry about foreclosures. Detroit got bailed out, and Wall Street got bailed out. But what about us? And these people don't use fancy phrases like real disposable income, but they know that for over a decade, their real disposable income has been stagnant. And they were really angry and felt that Trump was the only candidate who realized that anger. There were other aspects, jobs leaving, immigration, some racial angles to these stories, but you could sense the fanatic support for Trump, who still to this day can do no wrong. I mean, he famously said, I would argue the most famous quote from him of the last year, was that he could walk up Fifth Avenue shooting people and he would not lose his support. That his supporters feel that strongly about him. And that certainly was reflected in this election. So, lesson for me and all the pundits, some of them still haven't accepted the lesson. Lesson for me anyway is that you can't underestimate this guy. He is someone who you have to take very seriously as a very different politician with tremendous core support. I think that's a message you have to concede came out of this election. So, what's happened in Washington now? Well, first of all, the Democrats are still in maybe the 5th or 6th stage of grief. You know, there's a famous 6 stages of grief. Maybe they're getting close to acceptance. But I think they worry that they don't have the votes on most everything. Chuck Schumer might be able to filibuster against bills that do not directly relate to tax and spending issues, but otherwise the filibuster rules have been changed, and I think much of what Trump wants will prevail. Schumer knows this. He's certainly going to drag his feet on a lot of cabinet appointments, but I suspect most of them, including Tillerson, will eventually get through. Maybe not by a lot, but I think they'll eventually get through. What really worries Schumer and the Democrats right now is 2018. Only a guy from Washington will be talking here about 2018, but it's a really key story. If you look at who is up in 2018, of the 1/3 of the Senate, by 3-1 it's Democrats. And most of the Democrats up are looking really vulnerable. States that Trump easily carried. Right now the Republicans have 52 seats in the Senate. I think they could easily get to 56 or 57 in the 2018 campaign. And you talk to any Democrat on Capitol Hill and they'll agree. The Republicans are going to gain seats in the 2018 Senate election. It's a fluke, but it just so happens that most of the Senate seats that are up are held by Democrats. So that clouds everything for Schumer, because he knows a lot of Democrats will have to side with Trump because they have tough re-election fights to come. For the Republicans, I think that the key thing, and I have a lot of friends who worry about Bannon and a lot of the cabinet appointments as being too radical, too controversial. The key thing, in my opinion, is that most of the shots are going to be called, other than by Trump, by Mike Pence and Priebus. Pence and Priebus know how to get things done on Capitol Hill. They're best buddies with Paul Ryan. I think that they will be a moderating force to a large extent for Trump, and I do think they will ensure that a lot gets done. And I think on things like taxes, which I'll talk about in a minute, I think Trump will sign just about anything he gets from Paul Ryan. I don't think Trump will be that overtly involved in things like taxes. So let's talk about what happens after the inauguration. I joked all fall that if Trump did win, the only thing I was really rooting for this fall was that Inauguration Day be really windy. I would enjoy seeing that. See that thing flying around in the air. I think that'd be pretty good. So after the inauguration, which is January 20th, maybe that night, I think Trump will begin. So let's talk about what he can do in the short run. Let's talk about what he can do in the longer term. In the short run, and by late January, 3 or 4 things will happen. Number one, he will declare on the 21st probably that he is pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal. I think negotiations will cease on that. Personally, I think the U.S. loses a lot of influence, a lot of bargaining power in dealing with Asian countries. It's almost an abdication, but he got elected on this, and he's going to announce that the U.S., at least for now, will pull out of negotiations. Then he will formally notify Mexico and Canada that he wants to renegotiate NAFTA. And already Justin Trudeau has said, okay, let's talk. So I think some of this bravado, some of this tough talk is a negotiating tactic by Trump. He's the best at negotiating things like this. I think that he will get new negotiations, and he probably will get NAFTA changed slightly. Then I think also, in the same announcement, he will announce tariffs on Chinese shipments of steel, aluminum. There are 2 or 3 areas that are easy targets, and I think he will target the Chinese right away for higher tariffs. There is a risk, obviously, that the U.S. and China could go through a very, very rocky period, but I think Trump is willing to take that chance in order to extract a tougher deal, a better deal when all is said and done. Then also, on January 21st, he will announce the death of a wide range of executive orders, regulations that are pending, may be killed or delayed, and I would put in that category the fiduciary rule. I know a lot of you are following this in your industries. I think the fiduciary rule could be delayed, might even be killed, can't rule that out, but an awful lot of other regulations, clean air regs, overtime regs, on and on, these regs will either be delayed or killed, or the process will begin to undo these regulations. That's also happening in the first day or 2. I think also he will announce probably the most controversial thing of all, and that will be the deportation of illegal immigrants who have a criminal record. This will lead virtually all of them to flee to so-called sanctuary cities, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, LA. I don't know about the story here in Cleveland, but I think that these cities will take these people who are facing deportation, and that begins a really nasty fight that could hurt, perhaps erode Trump's political capital. And he will seek to cut federal aid to all of these cities that do this. And this could escalate into quite a battle. I think he has to get tough on immigration, at least talk about some deportation, because he has to know deep down in that a wall is not imminent. Maybe there'll be a better fence. I heard Kevin McCarthy, the #2 Republican in the House, a few weeks ago saying, well, maybe it won't be a literal wall, it might be a virtual wall. What the hell is a virtual wall? Can't quite figure that, if you go near it, you get a shock or something. I don't know what they're talking about. But I do think he has to do something on immigration. I think that would come as well. So there are several things he can do with a pen right away. And I think within a week or two, there'll be the announcement of the Supreme Court replacement for Scalia. I think that's coming soon. I think it will be a conservative. I'm told they're looking for a Hispanic conservative. There's a woman in Texas who I think is on the short list. But I think that will be announced soon. And Schumer will obviously give it a close look. But I think as long as the justice is reasonably moderate, that justice should be able to get through the Senate. So that comes soon. But the really big story, I think, that comes this winter is the abolition of Obamacare. The Republicans in the House are adamant, they're insistent that Obamacare should be killed because they promised it. They voted 52 times in the last 4 years to kill it, and of course it never succeeded, or the president vetoed most of these bills. So they're going to abolish Obamacare by the end of the winter with one slight problem. There's no replacement in sight. There is no one who has come up with a replacement other than, don't get sick. So there's going to be a long period, perhaps a couple of years, for Paul Ryan and others to come up with an alternative. The new Secretary of HHS, very conservative Georgia Congressman named Price, will introduce his reform proposal. It largely involves tax credits. It would reform malpractice laws. It would probably keep pre-existing conditions. But this is going to take a while. And there's no one on Capitol Hill who feels you can get a replacement for Obamacare anytime soon. So it's kind of in limbo. We kill it. It's killed by spring, but it's going to stay in place until there's a replacement found. But that clearly is something the House wants to do right away. So then we move to the longer term issues that will take a while, that you can't get done right away. And those two issues, the most dramatic ones, would be tax reform and infrastructure spending. Let me talk about tax reform first. I think that we are going to get the most dramatic tax reform in our lifetimes. There is no question in my mind that it has the votes to make it through the Senate, through this process called reconciliation. You take your spending bill, it only needs 50 votes to make it through the Senate. Timing will be interesting. I think the House will pass a tax reform bill by late winter, early spring. Then it slows down because the Senate will still be consumed with confirming all of these Trump appointees. And the Senate, just by nature, is more deliberative. They'll take their time. It could be summer before they're done. Then you go to a House-Senate Conference Committee. It could be just as the fiscal year starts on October 1 before we get a tax bill. Might be done a little bit sooner, but my sense on the effective date, which is so crucial for your clients and the macro economy, I think the effective date would not be retroactive. It's not like this economy desperately needs a tax cut right now. But I think the effective date could be October 1 when the fiscal year starts, or it could be January 1 of 2018. I'd be surprised if it's much sooner than that, because I think it'll take a while to get both bills reconciled in the committees. Yeah.
Talking corporate and individual? Or?
Yeah, I'll get to all of you. So the tax bill that is going to emerge will be a three-headed: individual, corporate, and most importantly, perhaps, international. Those three parts will all be in this bill. So it's going to be a Goliath. It's going to be a behemoth. It's going to be hard to move something that big really quickly. So let me take the individual side first. No question in my mind that the individual side will have a rate cut of top rate of 39.6 going down to about 33. This bill's going to cost so much, maybe that 33 will creep up by a point or two, but I think you'll see 33, 25, and think 14%, something like that will be the three rates. So the individual rate cuts are definite. I think it's also definite we will eliminate the Obamacare tax. That will go almost immediately. I think cap gains will probably go back to the pre-Obama level of about 20%. I'd be surprised if it went too much lower than that. 20% seems about right. There'll be quite a debate on the estate tax. You know, the Republican mantra for decades, it seems, has been kill the death tax. And I think the death tax has a good chance of going, or maybe they tinker with it and only, you know, a few hundred mega wealthy people would be affected. I think there'll be a big change there. The really big issue that I'm looking at, and I submit you guys should look at as well, is this proposal to cap deductions. I think it's going to happen. And that raises lots of interesting questions. What does that mean for the state and local tax exemption? I think that's gone. I think the House would like to get rid of that to begin with. What does it mean for three other really important deductions? Number one would be charitable contributions. I think there'll be a waiver for charitable contributions so that the amount you contribute would not be subject to the cap. Then you get to the mortgage deduction. And I think there's going to be some action here on the mortgage side. Maybe people will get to deduct half of the 1.1 million you can deduct now. Maybe deductions for a second home go. I think there will be some play in the mortgage area. It's going to be ferocious lobbying, but I do see something like that happening. And then the third issue, if we're talking about a cap on deductions, the third issue obviously is the sacred one, like motherhood and apple pie. That's the muni bond deduction. Do we really want to monkey around with that? My guess is if they do away with the state and local tax exemption, they wouldn't go after state and local governments twice by going after the muni bond deduction. It's a close call, but I think the muni bond deduction is safe. I think that would not be subject to the cap, but it's in play. It's a story we're going to have to look at very carefully for the next several months. Other things they'll do, I think the AMT is gone. I'm happy. I think over the last 5 years, I personally bought the Army a tank. So I'm happy to see the AMT go. And I think that there'll be several other issues that won't get resolved until we get the bill into the fall. But, oh, and the standard deduction goes way up. The standard deduction probably will get doubled. It might even get to $25,000 for couples. I think that's going to be part of this. Whether we get big new deductions for child care and elder care, not sure. The Trump people say yes, many people on the Hill say no. Overriding all of this is a really important issue, and that is, then we'll get to corporate in a second, but overriding all of this is a big issue, which of course is, how do you pay for it? Could this possibly be revenue neutral? And every estimate I've seen, even ones using a very generous dynamic scoring, and you all know the difference between dynamic scoring and static scoring. I'm sure a group like this, you know about this. Even using a generous dynamic scoring, you cannot make this revenue neutral. It's going to lose money. And Paul Ryan last year set the precedent when he chose not to pay for a big package of tax extenders for business. So, and Trump has stated just in the last week that it's time to prime the pump. So I am convinced that much of this will not be paid for, at least not credibly paid for, when it's all said and done. If the fiscal hawks in the House say, wait a second, this is crazy, it's too profligate, you could see the top rate not go to 33, maybe it goes to 35, something like that. But I do think that on the individual side, most of what I talked about is quite likely. On the corporate side, once again, we see a dramatic drop in the top rate. It's 35% now, but you add state and local taxes, it's higher. I think the top rate would go to the low 20s. Some are even talking about below 20. I have my doubts that it could be that much of a revenue loser. But I think low 20s for the top corporate rate is very likely. I think for pass-through companies, subchapter C companies, things like that, there'll be a big drop as well into the low 20s in the final bill. For businesses, there's going to be a debate over accelerated depreciation, but my sense is that stays. But a lot of other business tax breaks, maybe even the research and development tax credit, could get hit. The big story on the business tax front, unquestionably, is repatriation. This is a story you're going to hear about ad nauseum in 2017. And as you probably know, this would allow U.S. companies, big multinationals, primarily drug and tech companies, to bring back money they've stashed abroad, profits they don't want to bring back at a 35% rate, that they could bring back these profits at a rate of 6, 7, 8%. I think it will happen. I think these companies will be able to hire more workers, will buy more plant equipment, will have higher dividends. It'll be a positive story for M&A, and I do think the chances are quite good that we get repatriation as part of this corporate and international tax reform. Now, that said, I think that people have spent the repatriation money 3 times over already. There is going to be a chunk of money that goes to the federal government. A lot of proponents of infrastructure reform want to see it all go to infrastructure. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but there will be some move to put money into infrastructure. But before I talk about infrastructure, just a couple of other things. I do think that carried interest could finally die. We'll see what Mr. Mnuchin says at the Treasury Department on that one, but I think the carried interest could finally get reformed in this corporate tax part of the bill. Infrastructure. Trump is talking about $1 trillion in infrastructure outlays. I think there are just too many Republicans in the House who are leery of a number that big. Too many Republican fiscal hawks in the House who say, look, we thought in 2009 there were all these shovel-ready jobs. There weren't any. We thought in 2009 the money would come out quickly, but it got bottled up in the federal bureaucracy. So I think a $1 trillion price tag, I might have said billion earlier, a $1 trillion price tag for infrastructure is going to be too much for many in the House, and I think it will be watered down. How ironic. Donald Trump, whose real passion is building things, will probably be thwarted on a big infrastructure bill by his own party, by his own hawks within his party. So I would think that both taxes and infrastructure will not affect the economy until 2018. The tax provisions will be dramatic. The infrastructure provisions, I think, will be a little less dramatic than advertised by its proponents. And I don't think infrastructure gets finally passed by Congress until late next year. So what do we worry about? We're all probably in the same boat that we're paid to worry for our clients. And when you look at things for people to worry about, 2 things really stand out for me as we go forward. The first is geopolitics. Obviously we've got a bromance going with Vladimir Putin, so I don't see a big problem there. I do think things could get rocky with China. But if there's one area geopolitically that I really worry about, it's Iran. All of the generals around Trump just have this passionate antipathy toward the Ayatollahs and Iran. And I think that there's going to be a blow-up fairly soon. Maybe it's in the Strait of Hormuz. You can't saber rattle with the Iranians. You might be able to saber rattle with some countries, but the Iranian Ayatollahs, who, by the way, all believe that we're close to the apocalypse. These are tough cookies. And I do think that U.S.-Iranian relations could get much worse as we seek to tear up the deal that we got about a year ago. And all of the generals, Mad Dog, and all of these generals are on record as having extremely hostile views toward the Iranians. That would probably worry me, and I frankly think the Iranians would love to drag the U.S. into that part of the world and just occupy us for a while in that part of the world. That is the geopolitical issue that worries me the most, and we all know how easily Trump is provoked. He was provoked this fall by Miss Universe. He's very, very easily, Alec Baldwin can provoke him. So I'd say the Ayatollah of Iran could really provoke him. And I do worry that on geopolitics there could be a rookie mistake by a lot of very eager generals to flex their muscles. Second thing I worry about, and I haven't had a drink yet today, so don't think I'm crazy. I actually worry the economy could get too hot in 2018. I think the most unique feature right now of the U.S. economy is how tight the labor market is right now. I'm not sure I believe 4.6, which is the number we got a couple of weeks ago, but the direction is clear on unemployment. It's come down dramatically. The direction is clear on jobs created, 2 million jobs this year. And as I travel around the country, I am astonished at how many parts of this country are red hot. You ask people in the Bay Area in San Francisco or in the Northwest or in Texas, you ask business people, what's your biggest concern? Is it Obamacare? No. Is it regulations? No. Lack of skilled labor. I get probably more than any other answer as I travel around the country. And if we see an unemployment rate get down to around 4%, which I think is doable next year, then we get these mammoth new tax cuts. I think we could be looking at the beginnings of some real wage inflation. A little wage inflation is good. I think Janet Yellen would be pleased to see a little wage inflation, but that could be sort of like being a little bit pregnant. Once you start to see inflation pick up, it could pick up by quite a bit. So I have to say, the one thing that really worries me in the long term is interest rates. And I think that what we're going to see at 2:15 this afternoon from the Fed is just the first of many, maybe 2 or 3 next year, maybe 2 or 3 moves in 2018. And there's one accompanying factor that has been ignored. So we've got the threat of higher inflation. We've got the threat of the Fed maybe finally getting ahead of the curve. They're way behind the curve now. We've got an incredibly tight labor market. And then you add on top of it one story that everyone has overlooked. And that is, nobody cares about the budget deficit anymore. It's going up, and it's starting to go up fairly dramatically. There's new numbers that came out 2 days ago showing that in the first 2 months of this fiscal year, the deficit is way up. Receipts are down by 2%. Outlays are way up. Last year, the deficit rose by about 160 billion above the previous year. You know, for the bond market, usually something around 3% of GDP for an annual deficit is tolerable. Well, it was 3.2 last year, and I think it's going to be higher in this coming year as the deficit moves higher. As we all get older, as entitlements become a bigger problem. But the one thing that disturbs me more than anything else is that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are even talking about the deficit as an issue. They want to spend more. During the campaign, people, when anyone dared to mention Social Security, both Trump and Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama all said, we want to expand Social Security rather than look at possible reforms. And you look at the spending plans that Trump has, I am not aware of any credible answer that he has on how he's going to pay for the wall, how he's going to pay for more money in the VA, how he's going to pay for what looks like an enormous increase in defense spending. He's not talking about how he would pay for it. So you add a dramatically rising deficit to the threat of a tight labor market and wage inflation in a Fed that's finally tightening. I think that the thing that I worry about longer term as we go into 2018 is literally, seriously, the economy could get too strong and you could see interest rates go up by quite a bit. So I'm going to end with one last note. That's a quick comment on where the Democrats go from here. What's the climate in the next few years? I thought the vote about a week ago spoke volumes. When the House of Representatives rejected a young, aggressive, bright, articulate young guy named Tim Ryan from Youngstown, Ohio, in favor of Nancy Pelosi from Nodville in San Francisco, who was 76 years old. Talk about sending a message after an election where white blue-collar workers seemingly were ignored by the Democrats. They vote for Nancy Pelosi of San Francisco once again, even though she's hemorrhaged House members over the last decades. They voted to install her for another 2 years. I thought that sent quite a signal. I think the Democrats still don't quite get it. I think they're hoping for Trump to screw up on such an epic scale that it would be obvious in 2020 a Democrat could win. Well, let me tell you, those of us who keep hoping for Trump to screw up have gotten quite a helping of crow in the last few months. And I'm not quite sure I'm ready to bet against Trump again. So I'm going to stop there. We'd love to take questions. Yep.
What about the deductibility of interest for corporations?
Deductibility of interest for corporations, that may be effective. There may be a cap on corporate deductions as well. But that's not in the policy mix that I've seen right now. Haven't seen it. Other questions? Yep.
You were concerned about interest rates rising in 2018. But if you look at the Reagan years, as soon as the deficit was calculated after the tax cuts. Interest rates soared again, even quite a bit above the good old Carter rate. And that could happen very quickly here again. Let's say, as you say, they announced this in March. You think interest rates in the second quarter would soar?
Yeah. Yes. So I would concede that on this scenario of higher rates, the issue is time, obviously. It could come sooner rather than later. And I would also add a significantly stronger dollar also accompanied the Reagan policies. I personally think the dollar will be at parity with the euro by the end of the winter. And I think that we're going to see a much stronger dollar, much higher rates, and it may come sooner, absolutely. Especially if the markets begin to perceive a total indifference to the deficit. If that becomes a widespread perception, that would further fuel the rise in interest rates, absolutely. Other questions? Yeah.
A little bit about the two-part question, the role of the media with the new administration, how you see that progressing. And number two, on the polling side, we've seen Brexit, we've seen the Trump scenario. How is that going to change what you see on that front?
Well, the media and Trump have a really toxic relationship now. I'm not even sure he's going to hold another press conference, for months to come. He's given up on that. He has surrogates who talk to the press. I would argue, maybe not accurately, but I would still argue that the media made Trump about a year ago. He was on CNN almost every day. He was on Morning Joe, and they patched up their feud. He's now back on Morning Joe. I have a lot of good friends at CNN. I'm on CNN a lot, and I chide them at CNN. I chided them a year ago that they would have him on every day, and they said, well, he's good for ratings. I said, well, could you put live rooster fights on if that was good for ratings? Would you have dog fighting if your ratings went up? So they put him on every day. So it was a Faustian bargain, one might say, between the press and Trump, which helped to make him. And now the level of them, and now the press is a useful foil for Trump, because he can rant against the Washington, New York elite that always see. It's a big story on CNN. I got out the airplane today in Cleveland. Big story, headline. News flash, breaking news, Trump's son interviewed Interior Department candidates. That's breaking news. I mean, does anyone really care if one of Trump's sons was part of a vetting process? The press still has this gotcha mentality. I think they're tone deaf to how the country actually feels. Poll takers. I've talked to many poll takers, and I'll give you the exact same answer I would have given you in October. And the answer I gave them was that you talk to the poll takers, and in private, they question their own methodology. And they question not just the fact that it's an issue of cell phones versus landlines, or if it's an issue on the weightings. How do you weight rich, poor, black, white, young, old? The weightings, everyone has their own secret sauce. But what really worried the poll takers in October, and that concern proved to be prescient, is that an awful lot of people are reluctant to tell a complete stranger who calls you up at 8 o'clock at night and says, who are you going to vote for? What if you hold controversial views, like I want to get out of the EU, I like Donald Trump, whatever. And people with controversial views may have been reluctant to tell a poll taker with Brexit, with Donald Trump. So I think the entire polling industry is going through a real period of introspection. For me, personally, since I had to believe most of these polls, I will no longer believe the BS when they say, we have a margin of error of plus or minus 4%. Says who? I'd double it. If they say it's 4, I'd at least go to 8%, because I think that the only thing I will believe in the polls is the direction. If they're going up, if they're going down, that might tell you something. But the precise polls that we see, I think, aren't worth very much.
The LA Times, the one that got the last two elections right.
There's an LA Times, a University of Southern California poll, and they were widely derided because they had a bad mix of respondents. The mix, everyone said, was tilted. Well, they nailed it. So they are worth looking at. If you Google LA Times USC poll, there's a lot of articles on how they actually got it right. Other questions? Yeah.
Has there been any discussion on the legal immigration side of fixing how people actually get in here and how people stay after school? Or
it's a good point. And apropos to your point, there's a real debate over H-1B visas. I think When I'm in Seattle, if I do a talk like this in Seattle, the number one question I get is H-1B visas. Why can't we get more qualified people to come in to work in the tech industry? So there's a legitimate reason to reform immigration, aside from, the wall. But everything is all wrapped up in this, and my sense is most Republicans in the House are terrified to take on the issue, to be perceived as favoring any kind of compromise. Look what happened to Eric Cantor. Eric Cantor endorsed a compromise that was fairly modest, in my opinion, and he lost his seat in the House. So I think an awful lot of Republicans fear talk radio, they fear Hannity, they fear Limbaugh. So my sense is we probably will not get any kind of immigration reform anytime soon. Or if we get it, it'll all be punitive stuff, in terms of more money on the border, things like that. Yes?
What's your take on Mad Dog?
Matt, people who know him say this guy is great. And most Democrats say this guy is great. He'll win confirmation by like 85 to 15 in the Senate. He's that good. And he's a highly respected Marine general. Most of these people at that level are very well educated. Petraeus, for example, has a PhD from Princeton. He was never going to be Secretary of State because Petraeus has to meet every month with his parole officer. So I always thought that was a long shot to get Petraeus. But Mad Dog will easily get by. The one guy who, frankly, I think is problematic is Flynn. If you talk to the people who worked with him, you talk to anyone who's been around him when he was at the intelligence agency, he was an exceptionally combative and unlikable person. Nothing wrong with that if the results are good, but the results weren't good. He was unable to reform those agencies, and he does seem to have a little taste for conspiracy theories, his son in particular. Flynn, to me, is going to be a right target, but Mad Dog will be a genuine hero, in my opinion. Other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned Iran, but in the industries that I hear about, they're really upset about cybersecurity,
Yep.
hacking, cozying up with Putin, and whether
Yep.
he's, that whole corporate espionage, all
Yep.
that.
Yeah, I would worry. So in my list of things to worry about, I said geopolitics and the economy. If I got to add a third, I would say it's cybersecurity. And we saw, let's be candid, we saw a foreign country hack and try to influence our election. There's no question about that. The question is their motives. I know the Russians hate Hillary and the Russians don't like Obama either, but there's got to be really thorough hearings. And I'm pleased to see Mitch McConnell and most of the Republicans agree there's got to be thorough hearings on just what exactly happened and how vulnerable we are in the future to something like this happening. Do you realize the Chinese, this has been known for a couple of years, they have hacked into every one of the U.S. Fortune 500 companies with impunity. So I think there's a real cybersecurity problem. So I talked to someone who's an expert, I'm not, but I asked her, what do you worry about? She said, I worry about the fact that we haven't done anything and that someday we're going to wake up and have the cybersecurity equivalent of 9/11. Maybe the election was the cybersecurity equivalent. Or maybe someone hacks into the U.S. power grid. Or we wake up tomorrow morning and all of our bank accounts say 0.00 for our balance. I mean, there are a lot of stories that could unfold on this. And I would argue that this administration has not been sufficiently vigilant. And whether the Trump administration will, we'll have to see. But that's got to be high on the list of things that we have to worry about before we get an equivalent of 9/11 on cybersecurity. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you think the outcome would have been different if Bernie would have either gotten the nomination or been selected as
question.
the VP? And then, kind of a sub-question to that is, did the DNC make some type of deal with Hillary back in 2008 where she bowed out and let Obama go forward, and they almost guaranteed that she would be the nominee in 2016?
Well, first of all, excuse my French, but the most pissed off person in Washington, D.C. is Bernie Sanders, who has seen all of the WikiLeaks emails that showed that the Democratic Party hierarchy conspired against him. They clearly put roadblocks in front of his candidacy. And I am told that in private, Sanders feels he should have been the nominee, but more importantly, he feels he could have won. And you look at all these young people that I mentioned at the beginning who stayed in their dorms or stayed at home because they thought she was the candidate from Wall Street. I think more of them would have voted for him. And maybe more of the white blue-collar workers would have. I mean, he beat her in Michigan, in the Michigan primary. People forget that. So I think he could have done better. He's radical, but at least he was authentic. I mean, there was nothing about Bernie Sanders that was inauthentic. And I think that's important. And Hillary reeked of inauthenticity, if that's a word. And I think that was a problem for her. I don't think there was any deal cut in 08. I think she got caught. The stars were all in alignment for Barack Obama. She got caught by surprise in 08. But Sanders is very upset, which raises one other quick issue. And that is, who inherits his army? This enormous army of young people. We have a 21-year-old daughter. She and all of her friends adore Bernie, of course, because he would forgive student debt. That's like catnip if you're 21 years old. You know, bring it on. So I think that the big question is who inherits the army? And the answer to me, at least for now, is fairly obvious. That's Elizabeth Warren. I mean, Sanders just turned 75. I can't see him running in 4 years. That would be pretty, he's in good shape, but that would be pretty unprecedented. Warren is a young pup of 66. It's an old party with a thin bench. But I think she would probably inherit the army. And that would be a hell of a race. I mean, she would go right at Trump if Trump seeks re-election again. The Republicans have a really deep bench. Rubio gets 6 more years to get a little more gravitas. Ryan will be around. There's a new big star in the Republican Party named Tom Cotton of Arkansas. He's going to be a player. But when you look at the Democrats' bench, it's thin. I mean, Biden is even talking about running again. Biden has just turned 74 and he's had 2 brain aneurysms. He's talking about running. So it's a long way to go. But just to your main point, Bernie Sanders is the most pissed off person in Washington. He feels what he should have gotten was denied to him through very unfair methods. Yeah.
What do you think the likelihood that the Republicans, particularly in the House, continue the track record that they've had over the last couple administrations and not being able to come to agreement on anything?
Great question. So it could happen. If you didn't hear the question, but we have another round of dysfunction among the Republicans in the House. I think that the litmus test comes soon. At the end of the winter, probably mid-March, the debt ceiling expires. Remember that? The debt ceiling, every 2 years we got to go through this BS. So the debt ceiling will have to be extended. There's a lot of fiscal hawks and Freedom Caucus who would perhaps thwart Paul Ryan and not vote for an increase. So what happened to Boehner? Boehner did the only thing he could do. He didn't want to shut the government down. He went to Nancy Pelosi and got votes from Nancy Pelosi's troops. Well, if Ryan does that, there could be an uproar. Talk radio, a lot of Republicans could be outraged that he couldn't get a deal and had to go to Pelosi. So he could suffer the same fate as Boehner. In fact, I say, it's a nasty thing to say, but in some respects, Paul Ryan is just like Boehner without the drinking problem. So we shall see. You know, I think that the jury is still out on whether there's unanimity among House Republicans. I would argue that at least 40 or 50 of them could thwart Ryan at any point. So watch for mid-March on the debt ceiling. That's when we'll get our answer. Yep.
Kind of building off Don's question, do you
Sure.
think so you've got the Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus on one side, but in the Senate, you've got Rand Paul and a group of
Yep.
spending hardliners.
Yep.
Which one's more likely to put the brakes on deficit spending?
Oh, the House. I think the House would. In the Senate, there'll be enough Republicans who'll go along with big spending programs. And they've got Schumer. I mean, Schumer is a passionate advocate of spending a lot more on the infrastructure. Can you blame him? He's driven New York City roads for the last few decades. So I think Schumer and the Democrats would become unlikely allies of Trump on infrastructure. They'd all go along with a big infrastructure spend. So I mean, everywhere I look, I see more spending coming. I don't see, we had a 7 or 8 year period, I wouldn't say fiscal austerity, but I think we had a 7 or 8 year period of fiscal restraint where domestic discretionary outlays were almost flat. The increases come from entitlements. That continues to go up. But I think now, after 7 or 8 years of restraint, there's a lot of pent-up desire to spend. And I think you'll certainly see that in the Senate, and I think Trump can get his way in the House. But I'll reserve some judgment until that mid-March fight. That mid-March fight on the debt ceiling is going to be a really interesting story. Yes, sir?
Talk about the replacement for Obamacare. What kind of outline some changes and who might be the winners and losers there?
Well, the price plan, the question was replacing Obamacare. The price, and Price, as you know, is an orthopedic surgeon, very conservative, wants to abolish it, even has talked a little bit about major surgery on Medicare, which a lot of Democrats are saying, hey, bring that one on. You want to make Medicare an issue? We'd love to make that an issue in the next couple of elections. I think the Republicans have to cool the hubris on talking about Medicare changes if they want to get reelected. But what Price would do would have a program of vouchers where people would get a tax credit and they would be empowered to buy their own insurance. Easier said than done. I'm not sure you can explain this to everybody, how you go out and buy your own insurance with a tax credit. I think that's going to be a long slog, a tough sell. So this is going to have a couple of years of vetting before there's anything that actually emerges on this. And it puts an awful lot of people, I think, in limbo. I'm not sure what is going to happen next. Yep.
How much does Trump politicize the Fed and go and looking
Great question.
into 2018 with Janet Yellen coming up?
Yes, I think so. I'm really looking to see if there's a tweet tonight. If Yellen raises rates at 2.15 and her statement indicates there's more to come, does Trump get angry? He ripped into her in the fall saying that she should be ashamed of herself for creating bubbles, and he said that she went easy on Obama. And now that Obama's about out of office, is she going to go tough on him? So he could have one of his famous tweet storms toward Yellen. If he does, here's the thing that I worry about. Does it give a green light to people in Congress who want to significantly change the Fed's authority? And there are 2 or 3 bills out there. One would audit the Fed. I'm good friends with Don Cohen, who was vice chairman, and Don always said, no, it's not auditing our books, it's auditing our policies. And the Fed would view that as intrusive and intimidating. Then there would be a bill to decrease the authority of the New York City Fed, take away their automatic vote. Then there'd be a policy that they might even, the most radical one of all, is from John Taylor, the professor at Stanford, who would set explicit terms under which the Fed could raise or lower rates. So if Trump gave support to that movement to curb the Fed's authority, I worry, frankly. I think the markets would not like to see the Fed become politicized. And as my friend Don Cohen and others have said, you know, Congress has done such a wonderful job on fiscal policy. They want to run monetary policy now? So that's your, thank you for asking that question. I should have mentioned it. I think that's going to be a real concern. I may get the hook in 1 minute, so we'll take one last question. Yep.
So just segue onto other entitlement programs, what do you see that potentially is at risk with that Obamacare?
Nothing. I don't see any entitlement programs at risk. Trump has made it clear that he's gun shy about going there. And, you know, the root canal school in the Republican Party that would like to begin reform, I think, don't have the votes. I mean, I was in a meeting with Ryan about a year ago in which he said, we got to at least start looking at the COLA on Social Security, maybe have a diet COLA that's a little fixer of CPI. That would make some sense, but nobody in the party wants to talk about even a modest trim on the CPI COLA fix because it would be politically disadvantageous. So no, I don't, maybe some Medicaid cuts, I could see some there. Medicare, not a lot because I think it's politically explosive. So after this meeting with Ryan that we had, we talked to lots of friends on Capitol Hill and said, you know, Ryan's talking in private about some entitlement reforms, or at least beginning on some entitlement reforms. And everyone we talked to on the Hill said, no, we can't go there. It's an election year. We want to win Florida. So the desire to win Florida, to me, transcends any desire to go after entitlements until the problem becomes imminent. And I think we still have another 3, 4, 5 years to go before entitlements become a really imminent problem. I'm going to be around if you have other questions. You've been a great audience. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for having us.
And all the, it's like, you know, he's only touching on the stuff. You don't want to dig into something. Hey, Mark. What's going on? How are you doing? How are you? You be around for the holidays or you head out of town?
No, I stay at home.
Yeah?
Yep.
Makes it easy.
Sure does.
Have a good holiday. It's good to see you.
This one.